First, just thank you everyone for joining us. My name is Dan Barron. I am a board member for Bike Maryland. Bike Maryland is really thrilled that Noelle Battle, the executive director of Bikepacking Roots, is here tonight to share this Bikepacking 101 webinar. I'm going to briefly walk through a few logistics and then pass it over to Noelle, who's going to share all the information you are here for. First, I hope most of you are familiar with Bike Maryland, but for those that may not be, our mission is to promote bicycling, increase safety, improve conditions, and provide a voice for bicyclists in Maryland. We were formed in 1999, and we are a 100% volunteer-run nonprofit statewide advocacy organization. We work with partnering advocacy organizations, state and local government, universities, businesses, and communities to make bicycling a safe form of transportation and a fun recreational opportunity for all. So next, as far as housekeeping, we will post a recording of tonight's webinar on YouTube and on our website, bikemaryland.org. To avoid distractions, we're going to ask folks to keep your cameras off and your microphones muted. If you have questions, please post those in the chat during the presentation. We'll pause to take questions, and we'll use the chat to raise those questions to Noelle. If you have any questions after tonight's webinar, please visit bikemaryland.org to get in contact with us and to become a member. And Noelle will be sharing some really great resources tonight and ways to connect with Bikepacking Roots. And with that, I'm going to pass it over to Noelle to get started.
Awesome. Thank you so much. And thanks for having me. Great to connect with folks from other parts of Maryland. I'm Noelle Battle, the executive director of Bikepacking Roots, as Dan said, and excited to be here. I am in Baltimore, so I'm really excited. I've been a part of our organization for about 2 years, and we're a national organization, but I've been doing a lot more in the Mid-Atlantic region since I've started. So yeah, excited to talk with folks. I can't really, maybe if folks could give a thumbs up, or if you've been bikepacking before. It's a little harder in our virtual setting to see different skill levels, but hopefully this will be useful whether you have done some bikepacking or whether you're just trying to learn about it for the first time and get into it. So to start, just very briefly about Bikepacking Roots. We are a national nonprofit. We were founded in 2017 by two professional athletes, Kurt Ruffsnyder and Kate Boyle. They, as bikepacking was growing as a sport, we realized, wanting for people to be good stewards of the places where they were traveling. So, and also create quality, safe routes for people to get out there in the backcountry and more off-road bikepacking. So we really are the only national nonprofit exclusively dedicated to supporting and advancing the growth of bikepacking, growing a diverse community, and promoting access to and conservation of the landscapes where we ride. So we have 3 pillars: routes, community, and advocacy. So this is part of what we do. We try to lower barriers to bikepacking through education and events. So I'm happy to connect with you all today. I thought it would be helpful, just very briefly, to share my own journey with bikepacking. That I discovered it probably 15 years ago, like traveling by bike, but had no idea how to do it. My one bike was a road bike that had been given to me by my parents' neighbor. It was multiple sizes too big, and didn't have money to get into it. So it became this one thing on my bucket list, but I had no idea how to do it. And it really wasn't until I moved to Baltimore and became part of the bike community here, made friends, and gradually over time just learned more and more about bikepacking. So I think because I went on that journey, it really inspires me to help others lower a lot of the barriers, whether it's financial, educational, experience, understanding the gear. So this is just a quick chronology of my bikepacking. My very first overnighter up here in the top left was with an organization called WTF Bike Explorers. They're now Radical Adventure Riders. and I just, you can see strapping like a big, huge sleeping bag with bungee cords onto my bike and went out on my first overnighter. And I was definitely hooked after that. A year later, I did the Gap and CNO from Pittsburgh to DC. And then a year later, I sort of quit my job and went on created my own route and did a 4,200 mile, 3 month bike trip from leaving my door in Baltimore all the way up to like the northernmost part of Nova Scotia and back. So I just really dove in there. I've gotten more and more into like the mountain biking side of it. So the photos at the bottom of this page are doing the Idaho Hot Springs route in Idaho. And then my most recent trip was doing the Cape Loop in Baja in Mexico. So I tried to condense down, and I'll share at the end of this meeting. We have a lot of great resources that Bikepacking Roots has put on a whole series of webinars. If this webinar interests you and you want to dig deeper, but I tried to condense down some of the key areas for folks that might be really new to this of just like, what is bikepacking? There's a, and we try to have a pretty expansive definition of that term. A little bit about packing, how to pack gear on your bike and what you need to bring. And then a little bit about planning where you can find routes and sort of get started with thinking about what type of trip you want to go on. And then I'll share some more resources, and I try to put together some local route options as well. So to unpack the art of bikepacking, how we define bikepacking at Bikepacking Roots is bikepacking is riding your bike, generally off-road for more than one day. Bikepacking Roots has, we have focused on multi-surface, getting people off pavement, but most of our routes cover a variety of different surfaces. I think, that's the main distinction between bike touring and bike packing, but bike packing has kind of also just become an umbrella term for all of that. And I think that's great. I think a lot of beginner bike packing and bike packing in more populated areas is going to be on paved roads to a designated campground. And that's great. I think that's still, we'll talk more about all the different ways you can bike pack. Some people also define bike packing more as like the racing element of it. That is definitely a whole element of bike pack racing is becoming really popular. At Bikepacking Roots, we really focus on the non-competitive, community-focused side of things. So to unpack this a little more, what kind of bike do you need to go bikepacking? There's all sorts of different bikes. This is the bike that I rode on that 4,000 mile trip up to Canada. It's a steel cyclocross bike with kind of like a basket packing traditional pannier setup. Here's some other setups here, more of like a gravel bike. Different ways to pack. This is kind of showing different ways to pack your gear and different ways that you could set up a bike. Some really kind of lightweight setups that people have, fat bikes, adaptive bikes, other more fat bikes, bike pack in the sand and the snow. So really the answer is, this is our co-founder, Kate. She frequently she's 5'4", I think, and frequently bike packs on a full suspension mountain bike. So has solved the problem of how do you pack gear on a very small bike. But really the answer is, any sort of bike can go bike packing. I probably should have had a few more examples here of like, you can take your city bike, and usually there's a way to put a rack on it and put some gear on it and take it out on your first bikepacking trip. So it's, there are ways to get around that no matter what type of bike that you have. Here's a little bit of, we get excited about bikepacking, getting out into nature. I think this kind of goes along with general trends of biking in general, with gravel biking becoming really popular and mountain biking as people get more and more concerned about riding on the roads. So, it really can be anything. It can be trails, dirt roads, gravel roads, paved roads. Um, really depends on where you're looking to go and what type of surfaces you're interested in riding on. And then, more than one day essentially is what differentiates this from just going out on a day ride. And so often bikepacking, is camping in one way or another, whether that's at a designated campground, whether that's wilderness camping, or not wilderness, but dispersed camping, in all different types of setups. Could be staying in different accommodations, could be staying in. On my long trip, I stayed with a lot of warm showers hosts or couch surfing hosts. Warm showers is like a bike specific form of couch surfing. So it can be anything. I think the what's called credit card touring, where you pack less gear and you usually are, always sleeping inside, is another way to do it. That's when I bike traveled around Cuba. Camping isn't really super common there, so that's how I did it. So first I'm going to talk a little bit about just different ways to pack and things to pack, and then we can take a little break and I'll try to answer specific questions that folks have. This is, really there are endless options of how to pack. And even the pendulum is shifting a bit. There was, if folks are familiar with road touring historically, as I showed you the picture of my bike before, these big Ortlieb panniers in the back of your bike, maybe in the front of your bike as well, is how it was done. As bike packing became popular, 10 years ago, and there's been an explosion of bike packing gear makers with all these great bags, which is really, really cool to see. But everybody, went to have this seat pack and a handlebar roll, and can't use panniers. That's not bike packing. But actually now it's going back in the other direction of sort of smaller, more tightly situated on your bike micro panniers. People are discovering those are really handy and easy to use. And I use that because I have a small bike frame, and having a seat post bag doesn't really work. So it's a lot easier for me to just have a rear rack, put my sleeping bag on top of it, and then have small panniers that I use. So there's a lot of different ways this, and I'll show you a couple of different bike setups, and then we'll walk through kind of things to think about in terms of packing. Here's, a setup with where someone's put their tent at, on top of a back rack. As I said, typically I always put my sleeping bag there because my sleeping bag is always the biggest thing that I have. My tent packs down quite small. And then your panniers, you could put other things, clothing, sleeping pads, sleeping bags, your camp stove. Then often a lot of bikes these days will have mounts for specific cages on the front forks here. So you can use that for water bottles. There are also like many different types of bags specifically for bike packing that will go into these cages, or you can just use any old dry bag. And that's, another place. Sometimes I carry my stove and one of these fork cages, or my sleeping pad, or a sleeping quilt if it's not that cold out and I'm bringing something smaller. There are these top tube bags. This bike has a very long, like a bag that goes across the full top tube. More commonly, there's one that just kind of goes in the front, which is a really good place to put maybe some tools, maybe some snacks. They're also like the stem bags that you can hold an Nalgene in, or snacks as well are really good to pack. This bike has a custom frame bag in it. It's frame bags are really great to hold, yeah, like tools, locks, heavy things. When you're thinking about packing, you want to kind of try to pack the heavier stuff, closer to the center of your bike, and down lower. And then it's different options in the front. You could have like a smaller bag that holds electronics, snacks, or I'll show you on one of the other bikes. Particularly if you have a mountain bike with flat handlebars, you can have like a bigger handlebar roll in the front of your bike. Here's just two other setups that are a little different. So this bike on the left has the seat post bag that I mentioned. This is a pretty small one. They also make ones that are quite a lot bigger than that, that secure pretty well to your saddle and your seat post, and can fit a lot of gear. And you can sort of strategically pack that with heavier stuff down closer to your seat post and lighter stuff in the back. And this bike also has, with those flat handlebars, you can have a really big handlebar roll to carry, often your sleep system, or some of those bulkier items in there. And this is also an example of one of those smaller top tube bags. And then the bike on the right, is more of like a city bike, old school mountain bike. Again, and kind of shows a little bit more of a makeshift setup that you can have. This bike has the tent poles strapped onto the top tube. I have to do that as well. Now they make special bikepacking tents with short tent poles, but my one-person tent still has long poles, so I usually put them on my back rack, but this is another place to put them. And then they've also sort of kind of rigged up a dry bag to connect it to the saddle to carry some gear, and then put a big basket with a bunch of stuff on the front, like so. Just to show, there's a lot of ways to get creative. Here's another, couple DIY solutions of someone that has, just utilized a piece of wood to make their own rack, or also just showing, yeah, using a strap to strap any, a $10 dry bag to your seat post. So lots of things to do. You can also carry, if you don't have a way for one of your first trips to pack everything on your bike, maybe you don't have mounts for a rack. You can utilize a backpack or a fanny pack for carrying some gear. Just want to make sure it's comfortable for longer trips. Whether you want to be carrying that weight. I've seen people carry a full like backpacking backpack on their back, like a 40-liter one. I don't necessarily recommend that. It's not great for mobility of your neck, but there are ways to get creative with carrying things. So here's just to dig in a little bit deeper about packing. It's really going to depend on what trip you're doing. And the cool thing that I have seen is once you've packed, like once you've gotten over the hump of going on that overnight and packed for a trip, what you pack for an overnight is really not that different from what you would pack for a week-long trip, and it's not necessarily that different from what you would pack for 3 months. It's only limited room. You might bring, 2 pairs of shorts instead of just one. But then you're kind of using things over and over again. So packing for bike packing has actually become like one of the easier things for me to pack for than other trips where I have a lot more choice. But really you want to think about, where you're going, what's the climate, having the right rain gear, having the right layers to keep you warm, thinking about the right materials, wool or other materials that aren't going to, get you cold and help you regulate your body temp. how long are you going? Where, what's your plan for sleeping? And therefore what, where you are might dictate, whether you're bringing a tent or other type of sleep system. Are you planning on cooking? Are you planning on just like bringing food, but you don't need a stove? Or are you planning on just like, are there places to stop and get most of your food along the way? Um, and then also, determining again, what based on your bike, how much room do you have? Where are the places that you can pack things? So here's a little bit about the essentials for packing. So obviously, water. You'll want to think about how far you're going in between resupply locations. So how much water carrying capacity do you need? Um, you want to have and then also knowing like, are you going to just be filling up water at stores or do you need to bring a water filtration system? And is there going to be um, surface water that you can filter along the way? When we get into route planning, we can talk about that. A lot of routes that you might use that someone else has created, hopefully will have all these details about where the water sources are or the resupply options are. So thinking about like, are you okay with just 2 water bottles or do you need 8 liters of water because you're riding in the desert and you're going to have to go 2 days without water? Um, and being really mindful of, if you're camping somewhere that doesn't have water, that you have enough water for your dinner that night, for your breakfast the next morning, and for the ride, until you get to your next water source. Same for food, thinking about, what type of food you want to pack. Maybe a kind of easy way to go when you're just getting started is using the, backpacker meals that just require adding boiled water to, or you making your own food. What kind of, there's different options. There's a lot of great, like very small stove options that you can bring, and some pretty small cook kits that you'll get into. I'm not going to go into like too much detail on these, but thank you. So thinking about what you need for that. Also essential, you want to have your form of navigation. Um, our founder, Kate, always recommends, and I've gotten myself into trouble with this before, so I try to follow it now, is like always have 2 forms of navigation, whether that is having the route on like an app such as Ride with GPS on your phone, or having it on a specific navigation device like a Garmin or a Wahoo, or having paper maps. Like having at least 2 of those options, like not just relying on the navigation on your phone without any other backup, or just relying on it on a Garmin without it also being on your phone, is very important. And then having a small repair kit. I'm not going to go into all the details of what you would need, but based on, uh, what, whether you have tubeless tires or tube tires, having the ability to repair your tire, repair your chain, um, fix bolts, a good multi-tool, and some other tools in your kit. I do have a couple slides to talk about repairs. So you want to have that. And then your phone. If you're going to be in places where there is not cell phone service, it's a really good idea to have a satellite communicator that you could use for emergency calls or notifications. Then, making sure you have your correct layers, having lights for your bike, and a headlamp at night, I would say is an essential. Also having a basic first aid kit, and then, yeah, water treatment if needed. I use, which is like in this picture here, a little Sawyer squeeze filter system for, and then, have a small bag that goes with that. It's packs pretty small, and can use that whenever needed. And then, just kind of your basics, make sure you have all your medicines and the kind of basic toiletries, and then all of your kind of electronics charging. On long trips when you're a few days away, that can get complicated. So, um, if you're going to be relying on a phone and lights and um, a GPS device, just making sure you have enough battery power to recharge it and all the correct cords um, for the duration of however long you're going between resupply. And then, so to go in a little bit more just about, so those were kind of the essential things. And then thinking about, your overnight kit. Um, there's a lot of options for, and again, I'll share resources to those other webinars that we have that deep dive one, just on each of these topics. But tent is obviously the most common. But the people, you might hammock camp or have a tarp system or just a bivy, sort of, this is a photo of wild camping, just in a, sleeping bag pad on the ground. I feel like that's a little less common on the East Coast with all of the bugs. Not something I typically just use a small one-person tent. Um, and then, yeah, your sleeping system or your sleeping pad, which is, usually one of either the inflatable pad or like one of those photos that I had of the Thermarest, like accordion pad, which the benefit of that is it can't pop. You should bring maybe things to patch a pad, but the inflatable sleeping pads are pretty reliable. Um, and then a pillow. Your camp clothes, again, what layers you might need, depending on your trip, and trying to sort of plan that out and pack wisely. They're a good like down puffy jacket is really good because they pack really small and they can keep you warm. So that's always a great option. Of course, down once it gets wet is not good. So you want to make sure you keep that dry. Um, and then, yeah, for your kitchen, there's different types of stoves. Um, again, depending on what you're wanting to cook, what size pot you might need. I've switched down most of my trips now. I'm just boiling water for coffee or to rehydrate a meal. So I have a really small titanium cup that my fuel fits inside and a pocket rocket stove. Um, and that's been working really well for me lately. But I've gone on other trips where I've wanted to cook real food and I've carried much bigger pots. Um, you should be aware if you're camping in places where you should be bear aware and know how to do a bear hang or have other forms of protection from bears. And then again, depending on where you're camping, if you're backcountry and need to have a trowel and bags to take away out your waste, following leave no trace principles is very important for when you're bike packing. So those are sort of some of the key categories of things that you think about packing. Often, if you're going with a group of friends as well, a great thing is you can kind of split a lot of these things, thinking about your camp kitchen or other things to carry. And then this was just getting back a little bit more on, again, I'm not going to go deep into the topic of toolkits, but one thing that I've learned over time is really by preparing, making sure your bike is in good shape before you go on a bike packing trip can really, really save. I think I saw somebody quoted like it'll save like 80 to 90% of mechanicals that you might have. So giving your bike a good check over or taking it to a shop if you feel more comfortable with that. Making sure your chain is not worn out, making sure it's lubed. If you're going on a longer trip, bring some chain lube with you to clean it. making sure you've got air in your tires and your tire tread is not overly worn, like it's going to wear, could wear out any day. Um, you don't have frayed cables that like might affect your shifting. Um, your brake pads are have some life left in them. I had a bikepacking trip where 10 miles into the CNO, because of the rain and the mud, my brake pads were completely gone and I had no brakes. And I had to get 16 miles to Leesburg with walking down every hill. So I learned my lesson there. Um, one of the tightening all the bolts on your bike, particularly on racks and things like that, that's really, and that's something you want to do regularly. Um, is often what a key occurrence is, like a bolt will come loose and you don't want it to come all the way loose to the point where you lose it. Because then you'll be hopefully relying on those zip ties that you packed. Um, so that's this. There's a lot of different. I just pulled one photo of this is from Leah Fantle. If any people in the DC area might know her, she taught a good workshop for us last year. Key things you need is your pump, your way to change a tire. If you have tubes in your tires, then patch kit, a spare tube. You should have a spare tube, probably, whether you're tubeless or tubed. But if you're tubeless, then the, way to plug your tires and know how to do that if that were to arise. A good multi-tool that has all the size Allen keys that you need to fit in all of your different bolts that you might be adjusting, particularly if you might need to adjust your saddle or your handlebars or things like that. Um, all the, any racks that you have on your bike. Zip ties, a spare, a chain link, a chain breaker tool, and don't feel bad if this, is I'm just kind of rattling these off that might be over your head if you're not used to working on your bike yourself. That's okay. Some electrical tape and these wrenches. And, there's more as you are going on a longer trip. And again, depending on the details of your trip, often bringing spare cables, spare spokes, and other tools. So I will take a brief break. It's kind of halfway through the presentation before we get into talking a little bit about trip planning and things like that, and try to answer questions that we have.
So we've got a bunch of questions in the chat if you want me to share those, Noelle. So first question we had was around what is your take on using trailers?
Yeah, I think using a trailer can be great. I would just I actually like to bike pack with my dog. And so we have a Burley tail wagon. We were doing that in the Grand Canyon of PA last weekend. So I think trailers can work. Depends on the surface, if you're doing a really rugged mountain bike trail, we it's probably not recommended. But if you're sticking more to decent, either paved routes or rail trails or gravel roads, where that, it wouldn't be bad and, you're okay with pulling that extra weight, I think, that's a great option for bike packing.
Okay. And thank you, Reese, for that question. And then Heidi had a question about what is the recommendation for how much weight you should carry based on your rider and or the bike?
Yeah. There is a specific weight. I'm trying to remember if I've even seen like I don't think I've seen any sort of calculation. Um it's all about what you're comfortable with. I think certain people, you know, I'd say the founders of my organization and folks that like they're coming from more of a bike pack racing mentality, and they're like the lighter you can get, the better, because it'll just make things easier on me and it'll make me go faster. Um, I don't really care about going fast. And so like I've tried over the years to get my setup a little bit lighter. It does, if you're riding up hills, it's going to be harder if your bike weighs a little more, but you can always adjust how fast you're going. Um, so I think something as long like you'd want to test out if you put all your gear on your bike that like you're comfortable riding it around. Um, if you're going to be somewhere where you have to lift up your bike, that you can physically do it. I found that's the hardest part when I've traveled and I've had to like put my bike onto a train or onto a ferry. Like I can ride it around all day, but actually like that bike that I drove to Canada, like picking up the back of that bike, I think we weighed it partway through my trip and it was like 80 to 90 pounds. So probably more than I would recommend. But I think it's really about what you're comfortable with. I think, you don't have to be ultralight if, you know, there's there's sort of pressure to do that. There's one school of thought that, people still comment it to me all the time of like, why do you have all that stuff in your bike? And it's, I've got my tent. I've pared it down. So yeah, no set recommendation.
And then Kevin noted he didn't see any bikes with fenders and asked, are they a bad idea?
Um, No, my bike, that cross bike that I rode, I did have fenders. I didn't have, I did have problems sometimes of just like oftentimes that like, what's that noise and freaking out about like, why is my bike making a noise? And it was the fender got a little off centered or there was, leaves stuck in the fender. So if you're traveling somewhere where you might be encountering like really sticky mud and like fenders is just going to exacerbate that problem, then I could see them being a bad idea. But people definitely do bike touring, bike packing with fenders.
Okay, thank you. And then David asked for off the beaten path routes. How do you handle locations to set up camp, for example, permits?
Yeah. So it's really, I think, either utilizing a route that has been created, like I'll tell you a little bit about bikepacking routes routes in the next part of the presentation. Um, if you're utilizing a route like that, or we have a lot of background, it'll have the information about places to camp, and like whether it's a campground or whether it's just like after this point you're on public land so you can disperse camp. So you should know the rules about where you're going. And so whether you're finding a route that can hopefully guide you with some of that information, or if you're doing it yourself, you should know, if you're traveling, we're very big on only camp where you're supposed to. Um, you know, Camping on public land where it is legal and permitted to camp, and not camping on private land or places where you're not supposed to be camping. So knowing the rules of like in this state forest, are you allowed to camp? And then, often it's this far away from a trail or a water source, sort of knowing those rules. But there are, if that's not something you're super familiar with, like wanting to do the research yourself, there are like a ton of great routes out there that you can find that will have a lot of that research already done for you.
Great. And then I think Jonathan asked a question about additional spare parts to carry beyond tire and chain, but I think that may have been right before you got to the slide with the photo on kind of a day versus a longer trail. But there was also a question about if you have any thoughts on CO2 for air.
Yeah, I ride tubeless tires now, and I do carry CO2. I always also carry a pump, at least for a bikepacking trip. Um, I don't love CO2 containers, but nice. The one bad, like what I always run into is I fly a lot with my bike, and so I usually you can't fly with CO2 cartridges or camp fuel. So I usually have to try to find those things when I get to where I'm going. Um, but I would say don't rely on that as your only means for having it, because depending on how many flats you get, if you have two canisters, then you're out when you're out. Um, I haven't tried yet these like electronic pumps that I'm getting a lot of targeted ads for them these days that are pretty small. So those are maybe a better option, but you might also want to back up for, for something like that as well.
And I added a question in the chat, and I think you may have touched on this a little bit, but do you have any recommendations on things to avoid packing or any lessons learned about things not to bring on a bike pack?
Um, and people say you like pack your fears in, and so you just pack a lot. I think it's trial and error, really, of what one of the things that my friend says he does whenever he goes on a bikepacking trip is like as you're unpacking, just like account for everything and what you used and what you didn't use. And then that might tell you about what not to bring. I mean, some of these tools, just because you didn't use it, doesn't mean you shouldn't bring it the next time. But other things like, oh, I brought four long sleeve shirts. I should have just brought one. Um, and also, um, so I was going through Kate's slide. She had a good slide on like the non-essentials of like, if you really want to bring your little camp chair and that weight is important to you or your fancy coffee system, like it's very personal. Like some of those like extra things that might be frivolous to one person could be like make your trip really great. So um there probably are some things that but I can't think of any right now, like what not to pack. But I'd say trial and error and like learning, what works best for you.
That seems like a helpful response. Yeah, just reflecting on what worked and what didn't, and then adjusting as you go. And I think that covers the questions we have in the chat. But folks that are on, please feel free to continue to add questions. We'll take some more at that end.
Okay. So now I'm just going to talk a little bit about, um, so that was sort of the packing aspect of getting ready for a trip. Now this is sort of thinking about planning a trip. As bikepacking has gotten more popular, there are like more and more options, which is great. But it's helpful, one way to start your thought process is like setting your own personal goals of like what's important to you. That'll dictate your expectations for the trip, which is going to dictate your experience. And so, you're not gonna, if you just want to go on your first trip, you're probably not going to be looking at, um, shouldn't be trying to tackle a month-long trip if you've never gone on an overnighter before. I think if you're just starting, doing an overnighter is really the great way to start. But thinking about what your specific goals are, as you're kind of progressing in your bikepacking journey of like, is it completing your first overnighter? Is it doing your first solo bikepacking trip? And like, so how is your planning going to differ for that? Maybe doing your first single track mountain bikepacking trip. Maybe moving from the overnight weekend trip to a week-long trip. Maybe you want to take on the challenge of planning your own route for the first time, or riding cross country or riding with your kids, so many different goals, and that, will sort of shape what you're looking for in a route and your route planning. So there are lots of places for where you can find routes. This is, of course, Bikepacking Routes has a lot of great routes. This is our current map of routes. The blue ones are like our long distance signature routes, and all the red routes are what we've been curating this community routes collection for the last 2 years, working with really great route creators all over the country. So we're getting more and more in the Maryland um, area and surrounding area, which I'll call out a few of those at the end of this presentation. So we have great routes. We're expanding more and more around the country. We've also expanded to Canada. I saw someone was moving to Ottawa. They have amazing routes, and we'll be publishing actually 2 routes from Ottawa this summer as well. All of our routes have their own, like a full dedicated route page with like all of the stats on the route, We have a difficulty rating scale, both for physical and technical. They'll tell you like what tire size you need, based on the route surface, how long it is, what time of year you should go. There's like great narrative descriptions about what to expect, logistical details, and then links to the Ride with GPS routes that have a ton of POIs for all of the camping, places to camp, places for resupply, water. Like we've kind of done all of that research as well as, where there is dispersed camping, we have a whole checklist that we go through to vet all of any of the routes that we put on our site. So, and our big push with routes is like that we're committed to maintaining them long term and having this relationship with the person that lives near the route and can make sure it's staying up to date because um, you know, sometimes roads get washed out or they change or fences get put up if something becomes private. And so, these routes are sort of living in nature and need to be kept up to date. There are other great nonprofits. Some of you might be familiar with the Adventure Cycling Association. They have more pavement routes, but they do have the Great Divide mountain bike route, one of the most famous bikepacking routes out there. And then, we share on our website as well a few routes from other nonprofits that we're connected with as well. Um, you also can, go directly to a route creation or mapping software. We work with Ride with GPS, our key partners, where we share all of our routes now for free through Ride with GPS. They are coming out, they're always innovating and they have a lot of tools on there to search for a specific area and look where there might be routes nearby. They also do have a system for rating routes and leaving reviews on them. But one thing to be cautious is, you might want to check that if a route has been rated or there's much information on it, you could find routes on Ride with GPS that somebody just created sitting behind their computer. They've never been there, they've never ridden it. So there's not as much sort of confirmation of the vetting process. You could try to send them a message and ask them. I know people that do that. And then there are other websites. Bikepacking.net is kind of the original route site that's been around for bikepacking routes. And then bikepacking.com is probably the biggest and most popular these days source of routes all around the world, and a lot in the US as well. You can also find there's local events that put on bikepacking races. You could usually look on their event pages and find their routes. I work with someone who puts on an event out in West Virginia called Grusk, which is a great event. So, you could find things like that. Often, same with Ride with GPS, it's like some race routes specifically, like because of the nature of the race, don't have a lot of those logistical details. You're kind of on your own to figure them out. So they might have more limited resources than some of these other options. There's often, also a lot of like local bikepacking organizations. If there are bikepacking friendly, like specific bike shops, they might have a collection of routes. Or other, groups in different areas. I don't think I had any. There are some good Facebook groups not in Maryland, but that I am aware of. But there's a DC one, a Virginia one, Pennsylvania, West Virginia. There are some other good groups where people are sharing information on bikepacking trips that they do. And then there are brands that put out some routes. Rockgeist is in North Carolina, so they have sort of a collection of routes down there. And so this is, those are all the different places to go. This is an example of what a route looks like in Ride with GPS. This has a few, not really too many POIs on it. It just has a POI for like where the camping location is. Um, but if you look at like some of our routes, they'll have a bunch of other sort of these points of interest to help you plan a longer trip. But this was just like a very short overnighter that we were using as an example of, just going there, biking out 7 miles, camping, and then doing a loop back. Um, you can take, so you can download Ride with GPS on your phone and utilize their app to navigate from, which is great. They do there are certain features that are available if you have a free account with them. There are some of the route creation and other features that you do need a paid account. So depending on how deep into the bike packing you get, that might be a useful tool. And then you can also export these files from Ride with GPS into something like a Garmin or a Wahoo or another navigation device. Um, just another example here of an overnighter. So just thinking a little bit about, I tried to put some criteria for, if you're researching a route, or trying to plan your own, things to think about. So the first thing I kind of got about that a little bit already is that, you know, understanding how the route was created and who, is it from a reliable source that, has done all this research and it's kind of been vetted, or, is it up to date? When was it last sort of confirmed? Um, some of the bikepacking.com on their routes, they have a forum there with where people that have can ask all sorts of questions, whether they've ridden the route or not. And those are, I would advise, if you're using one of their routes, like read through all those questions because you can gain a lot of information about people's experience with the route. Um, and then really just, looking at the route, these photos here are some more snapshots of like what the route page looks like on our website. Um, but planning for yourself when you're looking at a route, how many miles do you want to ride? Do you feel comfortable riding in one day? If you're new to bike packing, you usually kind of plan on doing less miles with the bike loaded up with gear than you would normally do unloaded. And similarly, if you're newer to like gravel off-road riding, you're going to want to plan on doing a decent amount, like it could be half or whatever the ratio is for you, less miles than you're used to kind of just doing on a typical road ride. So thinking about that and thinking about like, does the route have places where you can camp or stay, that coincide with the mileage that you're comfortable in doing. Um, Thinking about the technicality and physicality of the route. So we have Bikepacking Roots we've created these rating scales, which we've tried, that kind of can look at, what the terrain looks like, in terms of like climbing, how physically difficult it is, and then also, technically in terms of the route surface of like, whether they're really technical trails or not. So this is helpful as a guideline. I think, it's really important for people to understand their own abilities and calibrate these scales. Like when I was starting out, of like a 3 to 4 on a scale, on bikepacking.com is like as hard as I can do. So it's not just, kind of thinking, 1 to 10 of like for your own personal ability. But these are helpful. We have a scale. Bikepacking.com also has a similar rating scale for their routes. So thinking about how physical is the route? What are the surface types? Like how challenging is it going to be? That'll impact how many miles a day you can ride. Um, and then elevation is really important, that how much, whether it's a flat route or a route with really steep, long climbs, is something, to judge again with like how difficult it's going to be and kind of what you're comfortable with doing. Um, and then think, again, looking at where, like, what are the options for camping? Is it campgrounds? Is it dispersed camping? Is there lodging along the way? And like, does this route have those options for you based on your what you think you'd be able to do on a trip? And then similarly, noting the food resupply. Um, Often, if you're going to sort of small towns or places, knowing whether places are going to reliably be open, often we recommend like call ahead and make sure the store will be open if you're going to be like definitively relying on it for your food that day. I've had to try to race up and over a mountain pass in Idaho to get to a place that I thought would have been closing at like 7 o'clock. And turns out they were just closed that day anyway. So um wasn't able to get food until the next day. Um Identifying water, whether it's, or stored or resupply in or water that you can filter. This is usually easier out here on the East Coast. There's prominent water as opposed to in some of these photos that are out in the desert where you might be needing to get your water from a cattle trough and filter it. Understanding the land management agencies, again, are there any permits that are required? I was just up in Pennsylvania and in those the Tioga and Ticonderoga State Forest, you do have to get a permit for dispersed camping. I think it's free, but you should apply for it. So kind of understanding that process. Or are you going to a campground where you need a reservation? There are um, some campgrounds that have, no turn away policies for hikers and bikers. I think probably I don't actually know the rules for some of like the camping along the Gap Trail. Um and I mean the CNO is kind of first come first serve, but I think you can usually squeeze in if needed or bike a few more miles down to the next campsite. So understanding, what kind of things you need to be aware of and plan in advance or not. Um, Always good to think about, like, are there options to modify the route? Take a shortcut. If you need to evacuate or you're just tired and, this is taking way longer than I thought, kind of planning out your optimal route and then planning out maybe a backup plan if things come up and, yourself or others in your group just need to shorten something up that, probably happens quite frequently with some of these trips. And then, as I mentioned before, making sure, what the cell coverage is and whether you're being prepared for that. So this is just a checklist. I can send this out along with some other resources afterwards of just kind of thinking of like this is going through kind of various different elements that I talked about today of, thinking about your route, having this checklist of like knowing that you have your route downloaded, that you have all the POIs that you can reference, all your things are charged, and you've got your two forms of navigation. Like, is the route like open, legal? Um, the bridge isn't washed out. Trying to do that research to the extent you can. Sometimes you'll get surprises. Um, and just, knowing all those alternatives. And then, so that's for the route. On the bike side, doing that like pre-bike check, and then making sure you've kind of got on your bike and you're comfortable riding it around with the gear that you have on it, that you can still steer and you can still turn your pedals and everything. Feels okay. And then, that you've packed gear, most importantly, that's gonna like be adequate for whatever conditions that you're in, and that you've got your tools and your, first aid in case, and your communication device. And then that you've got your plan for food and water, and cooking. So those are kind of all the high level components for the checklists. I'll go through, I've just got two more slides and then I'm happy to take any more questions that folks might have. So as I mentioned, Bikepacking Routes has a lot more information for further resources. Our co-founder, Kate Boyle, who is a great educator, her webinars have been really amazing. We do have a series of, I think there's the first year we did an 8-part series of workshops that were based off of a book that we also sell called The Bikepacker's Guide, which is a really handy resource. And so then we have all these on our YouTube, where you can deep dive into like food and nutrition or the bikes and gear or trip planning. We've also done a few guest webinars. I just did one last month with Ride with GPS, and we had another one last year, more on the navigation and learning more about that. So lots to kind of deep dive into these topics that I just very briefly touched upon. We do have a community events calendar. It's national, so we try to add any community focused events that have a non-competitive element, whether it's a bikepacking overnighter or a workshop or things like that. So if we find out about them, if you know of any, feel free to share them to the calendar. We try to put those up so people that might not already be connected into certain bikepacking communities can connect with things that are happening nearby. I think Leah Fantle in DC does do some beginner bikepacking trips. And I know there's some cool things going on in Richmond sometimes. And so there are some things in the area. One of the biggest things that to let folks know about is we're doing a Northeast Bikepacking Summit at the end of July. This year it will be in New York, just north of New York City, actually transit accessible for folks that are adventurous and would want to take the Amtrak train there, and you could ride 30 miles, or you could take the Amtrak and switch to the Metro North train, and then be within 3 miles of the farm where we're having the summit. So that we're planning on having about 150 people there for the weekend, with workshops and rides and a lot of great educational things, an expo with some cool brands, and then all culminating in people going on different overnight options. Yeah, so you can camp. We basically, there's I'll make sure you get the link for the summit. We're gonna have like a base camp at this farm on Friday and Saturday night, and then there'll be 3 different overnight bikepacking options on Sunday night for people to go on for different levels and experiences. So that'll be a really great event. We did one along the Gap Trail in Ohio Pile and Confluence last year, and it was really successful. Everyone got lots of great feedback. So we're excited to do it again in New York this year, and probably in 2026 it'll be in West Virginia. And then there's a lot of other great resources, outside of Bikepacking Routes for this. One that I've seen lately is a group out in Idaho that I'm connected with has been putting a lot of their resources on a Substack, and they, kind of go through different aspects of bikepacking. So it's been a handy resource. I can make sure that link gets shared. And then last, I just wanted to share, I put this together today, to try to share a little bit about, like, we're all from Maryland here, different places to go. As I've mentioned, I think we're very lucky here, like having the CNO so close. I think and the fact that once you get 20 miles out of DC, that there's campsites along it every 5 miles. it's a really great option to get out on a first overnight trip, either starting in DC or starting anywhere else along the trail. Um, that's a great place to get started, I think. And similarly, doing the trip from Pittsburgh to DC or DC to Pittsburgh is a really great way to, do your first multi-day trip because there's lots of resources in place to resupply. It's, easy navigation. It's, easy graded trails. Um, so those are some good, really good intro options. We do have more and more routes on our website. I will say these routes are more challenging. We really want to have more beginner friendly routes, and I think hopefully we'll be adding them. But the nature of the terrain around here, kind of once you get out toward the mountains, there's a lot of steep climbing. But we've got some routes, one in Michaud State Forest in Pennsylvania, a couple in Western Maryland, PA, West Virginia area, some really pretty riding out there. A really cool route that I got to ride last year that was just published last year, in New Jersey, that you can take the train to Trenton and then ride through the New Jersey Pine Barrens, and the route ends in Atlantic City, and then you can take the train back to Philly. It is sandy, but he's actually recently ridden it on a gravel bike and determined that you don't have to have as fat of tires as originally thought to ride the route. So that's a really cool one. We're working on a project in the Monongahela National Forest that's going to have 30 new day gravel routes and 8 new bikepacking routes, connecting all the 12 towns in the Monongahela, the Mon Forest Towns project. So that should be done by the end of this year. The person I'm working with on that also created another network in like the Morgantown area of West Virginia. So there's a brand new bikepacking network. There's other routes. There's really cool overnighters that you can put together for folks that are in the DC area. If you like riding trails, the MoCo Epic routes, and there's connecting the single track trails all around Montgomery County, and camping at places like Little Bennett. Can do some really cool weekend bikepacking trips there. There's also a route on bikepacking.com in Loudoun County, Virginia, that I haven't done yet, but I've heard good things. And then one of our regional stewards who lives in DC, Jeff Patterson, he has a website. A lot of his routes are already showcased on our website, but he has a website with some other routes that are all, he doesn't have a car, so he only uses train travel typically to get to routes from the DC area, and he's created a lot of routes of like getting off of the CNO and doing a bit more adventurous riding of different lengths. So there's more and more developing in the immediate area, which I'm excited about. So thought that might be useful to give folks a few resources. So happy to open it up to additional questions now.
Thank you so much, Noelle. There's so many great resources, and then also ending with some nearby routes is pretty exciting just to think of maybe where to start or where to go next. There was one question in the chat, which I think you touched on when you were talking about planning routes, but someone noted that they know that New York State rules let you camp in any state forest unless posted otherwise. And then they were asking if there's a resource with those kinds of rules for each state that you might be aware of.
Yeah, I don't think so. And even Pennsylvania Environmental Council has been having a Pennsylvania Gravel Summit for the past couple of years, and I went last year, and that was like bringing folks together from route creators and event hosts and the state forest and the state parks and the game lands, and to try to help like create resources just like that for Pennsylvania, because even even among people that like understand things well, like for Michaud State Forest, for example, like the rules are quite convoluted and like to try to decipher that. So it's not even necessarily always clear on a state level. So I don't know of any resource that would be like where nationally you could see that. There is adventure cycling did a lot of work. I think that it could be a bit outdated by now, but they do have a resource linked on their website somewhere where they have all of the hiker biker campsite rules and like whether states have no turn away policies for in campgrounds for bikers, because there are some states that like if you go there after, sometimes you have to go after dark or after 5 p.m., but and you show up under your own power as a hiker or a biker, like they have to find somewhere for you to stay. But there are other states where they can just turn you away. So there is a compiled resource for that. Again, some rules may have changed because it was created years ago. We're trying to get into some of that advocacy as well. There is another person that's kind of picked that up, and I could share his website. But I don't think it has information about like state forests, camping, stuff like that. Usually requires a little bit of research from what I understand.
From your earlier slide, sound like important to research too, just to make sure information is current. You're not showing up surprised that something has changed or something's not available.
Yeah.
And then there was one last question that was posted about asking just for clarification about the last resource you noted about routes available after taking the train and getting off to ride. Maybe somebody's compiling options from DC to ride out.
Yeah, it's called, I'll make sure to send it in my email. I believe it's called canalbyways.com, I think,
Okay.
but I will check. Yeah.
Okay. All right. Well, any last call for any last questions? And if not, we'll just thank you so much again, Noelle, for this. It's been fantastic, and I think as somebody noted in the chat, just really informative and makes you want to get out and ride, which is always great. And appreciate your time and knowledge and all the information you've shared this evening.
Yeah. Thanks for having me, and thanks everyone for joining.
All right. Thank you so much, everyone, for joining us. Please feel free to connect with Bike Maryland, bikemaryland.org. And I also dropped the link for bikepackingroutes.org. And Noelle will be following up with some additional information that she's mentioned tonight. So appreciate that as well. Take care, everybody.
Thank you. Bye.